When we hear that among Putin's objectives include international recognition of his territory, limits on the size of Ukraine's army, a ban on NATO membership, and no foreign peacekeepers in the country, how close are we to peace, Sir Peter? Good morning, sir.
Good morning to you, Nick. Well, we're not at all close, and it's interesting how the course of this negotiation has led to a situation where Putin, the aggressor, is now calling the shots. I would have thought the gap between what he's asking for and what Ukraine will tolerate is pretty wide and might take quite a lot of negotiating time to close.
What happens next if Russia does not sign up to this, Sir Peter?
Well, I think that America will re-engage to try and achieve the ceasefire that it's promised, that Mr. Trump has sort of staked his reputation on for the early part of his tenure, having said hitherto that he could stop the war in its tracks in a day. I think we're going to discover it's going to take weeks, months, and years, perhaps, to do that. But I mean, I think the objective is absolutely right. I think the approach that's being taken, effectively putting the aggressor on a pedestal and treating the Ukrainians who've shown the most phenomenal resolve and taken the most immense punishment across their military forces, across their civilian populace, and across their infrastructure, which is going to scar the country for decades to come. I think it's extraordinary that we've come at this from this direction, and people will just have to redouble their efforts. But Mr. Putin, I don't think, is going to come to the party on anything like the terms that, excuse me, that people might have been hoping for. He's not going to be passive, and he's very, very clear in his long-term objective, which is to reestablish, in lowercase, the Russian Empire, something more akin perhaps to the Warsaw Pact, with that sort of cushion in the sort of near abroad of Russia that gave it the security that it had throughout the Cold War. And his objectives are very clear. They're long-term, they're grand strategic. And this, in comparison, this ceasefire is got much narrower, shorter term objectives, and he will stick to his guns because he has the leverage.
If you were commissioned, General, to write a report on the activities of NATO regarding this conflict, would you say could do better, first class, lamentable? How would you characterize NATO's response?
Well, insufficient to achieve a clear-cut goal. I don't think NATO went into this knowing what success for it looked like, or what success for Ukraine looked like. The way that the conflict came about meant that success for Putin was relatively easy to fudge, because he would have captured some of Ukraine, albeit his initial invasion plans failed miserably and lamentably. Success for Ukraine is so much harder to define in a positive way and achieve, because they had already been forced to surrender so much of their territory in the east, in the Donbass region, from 2014 onwards, and had a rolling conflict there for all that time up until 2022. And so, but the fact that it's hard to define and hard to achieve doesn't excuse the lack of a coherent plan against which people could gauge success and ramp up resources and commitment as required. And so it's been drifting. It's been hindered by Mr. Biden's reticence. That's now been compounded by Mr. Trump's complete lack of concern for the future of Ukraine. So I think NATO's performance has been, frankly, better than some people might have expected from the early days in 2022, but actually not sufficient to do much more than keep Ukrainians in the fight, unable really to make the sort of breakthrough they need. And we can track, you'll remember, Nick, you'll have had many of people on your program talking about this. Mm-hmm. Every time there was an escalation in the sort of weaponry that was going to be provided by the West to the Ukrainian forces, it was delayed, it was insufficient, the rules of engagement were kept on a very tight rein and so on. We didn't give them an unfettered opportunity to maximize their chances at the time when the Russians really were reeling from the initial pushback from the Ukrainians. So I think it's been a very disappointing effort. And I don't really see how, if we switch now to what happens next, and not NATO, but NATO nations and the coalition of the willing idea for the ceasefire, that without significant American underpinning, I don't see this coalition of the willing really being man enough to enforce the sort of mandate that might come out of the ceasefire.
Let's come back to the UK. Question on combat stress in just a moment. Last question on other matters. You talk about being man enough. I'm afraid I don't have the figures to hand, Sir Peter, but what the size of the British Army was when you were Chief of the General Staff. It's now approaching below 80,000. Fewer troops than you'd get into Twickenham Stadium. How concerned are you about that?
Well, very. I mean, so it was 102,000 when I assumed command of the army. And under the fairly draconian Cameron cuts of 2011, it was scheduled to go down to 82. It's now hovering around 70, I believe.
Yes.
And so manpower is incredibly important, but so too is weaponry, logistics, ammunition stocks, and so on and so forth, and the funds to train people to a high pitch to be able to orchestrate, the very complex mixes of forces that we now have to field in this modern era with drones, etc., and all those sort of cyber and all the new aspects of warfare that are so prevalent in Ukraine now, which is frankly is the petri dish for modern warfare. So we are in a sorry state, and that is a consequence of 10 to 15, maybe 20 years of consistent underfunding, driven by complacency, driven by the peace dividend being channeled into social welfare expenditure and that sort of thing, and a reliance on American goodwill. And it's not lost on anyone in America that effectively, indirectly, their taxes are going to pay our social welfare bill. Rather, while they don't have anything like that in America. So it's not surprising that we've been called to account, and we will need to spend well north of 3% of GDP for a decade to make any serious inroads on the challenge.